The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be with you today. My name is Scott Lloyd. I'm the president and CEO of MTM Services and the lead SPQM data consultant. And also a National Council for Mental Wellbeing consultant. We're going to be talking today about staff retention. And I've got to tell you that this is definitely one of the biggest topics that we've had as far as people signing up and wanting information and registering for this event. And as we're going to talk about here in just a little bit, there's a really good reason for why, and there's a lot of things we're seeing across the country. And so we're going to talk to you about that. And I think that's really the big key today is maybe a little bit differently than I did in St. Louis for the National Council Conference. I'm going to probably move a little bit slower today, be a little bit more conversational on some of this first part, and then do as much as I can in regards to the second half of our presentation. And a lot of that also may come off of your questions. So please feel free to chat in your questions. Samantha is on the line and monitoring what we're doing in regards to typed in questions, and will definitely cue me on anything that we need to get to. But let's go ahead and jump in. And then as well, you're also going to be hearing from Ginger Warner, who is a member of our team that works with teams around the country and has for years now in regards to marketing and growth and strategy and really helping teams maximize what's happening in their environments. And so you're going to hear a little bit from her this morning as well. So hopefully that's going to be helpful as we go through. Obviously for MTM Services, we've been around for almost 30 years now. I've been doing this job for 26. I've worked with over 1,000 organizations in 49 states, in several foreign countries as well. So what we're going to be talking about today is not I think this is what's happening. This is not going to be something that's a beta test concept. What we're going to be talking to you about today are the things that we're seeing and hearing every day with the clients that we're working with all over the country, and organizations just like yours that are working all over the country to try to help deliver the best care that they can. If it helps, and I found that for folks that it does, because sometimes people feel like when they hear consultant, they think of a business consultant who doesn't understand behavioral health. What you'd want to know is that this is a second career for me. I was in a private for-profit industry and actually left there. And I love being a part of helping organizations make positive and substantial changes. I like helping those who help. And a big reason for that for me is that I was actually raised by an addict. And so I come from a place of experience because I lived in that environment, which was not a good or a fun environment. I got to watch them become sober or earn their sobriety, and ultimately has stayed sober for more than 30 years. And so I've gotten to see the full continuum of what it's like to be lost, what it's like to see that person get found, and to find that new life. And so for me, I like working with providers all over the country that I know are helping the 13-year-old me, like the people who did when I was young and went through that time. I also work as a professional photographer. I work with American Ninja Warrior, World's Strongest Man. I do a lot of shoots all over the country. Corporate, everything is just for me, that creative side. So even though you're going to hear me talk a lot today about calculators and I'm sorry, team. Nothing like doing a national webinar, getting choked up right in the beginning of it. Sorry about that. But I also have a creative side and am a real person, even though I will be talking about some things like our costs and productivity and all those fun topics that everybody loves. And as well, I am the president and CEO of Racing for ALS. We are a race-based charity that has raised over $1.5 million. It's actually now $1.6 million that has gone 100% to help fund ALS research and ALS patients in need. And that's something we've been doing here since 2018. And we now do it in memory of my brother, who we lost this time last year to ALS. So if that helps, again, I am not just some corporate consultant. I really do understand the industry. I love the industry. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is giving you those perspectives on what we're seeing. So when you talk about current realities, what we hear nationally is very simple. Staff are tired, staff are burning out, staff are stressed, staff are anxious, staff are leaving. And that last one is in red for a reason. Right now, we are seeing staff turnover rates and staff vacancy rates that are the highest I've ever seen in my 26 years. And I know folks that have been in the industry even longer than that who would agree that this is definitely an anomaly, because what we're seeing nationally is the average team has about a 40% vacancy rate And so they're trying to run the organization with 60% of their normal staffing. And so it's causing a vicious cycle. It's causing a cyclical impact to where, again, we're seeing a lot of folks that are burning out. And it's basically, as we can hire the next person, that person that was already really burned out and really tired is now leaving. And so instead of being able to kind of gain on it, for a lot of organizations, they're just kind of continuing to plug folks in, and then the folks that they had burned out while the vacancies were there are leaving. And so you have to be able to do things to get ahead of it. Now, a quick side note, and maybe I guess a little bit of housekeeping, I probably should have said at the very beginning, I'm sitting here using all kinds of hand gestures and things like I normally do in my presentations. We are having a technical issue with our GoToWebinar platform today, and that is actually why we will be moving to a Zoom webinar platform starting next month, that we cannot be on camera today. So I apologize. We normally like to emote a lot and use our hands. So I guess you'll just have to kind of visualize there. And again, I apologize that we can't be on camera today. But when you look at it, when you talk about staff leaving, that's just pointing out what most people know. Again, I don't think you would be in a webinar around how to try to keep staff and how to try to keep them engaged and have that retention if ultimately, you didn't already know that staff are leaving. So what you really want to understand from there is why are staff leaving? And when you go back and look at that, that's the most important way to be able to solve the issues that we face. Because when you put it bluntly, what we are seeing is that for a lot of teams, they feel like they're serving their systems more than their consumers, or that their systems have overtaken them. And so ultimately it's, hey, I would love to work with my consumer today, but I've got like 18 progress notes I've got to finish. So I'm hoping I get some no-shows today because I've got supervision coming up next week and I don't want to get in trouble because I'm behind on my documentation. Or, hey, I would love to work with this consumer, but our EHR is broken, or our IT system is down and so I can't sign in. Or so it makes sense. It's like, what's happening with our systems that's keeping us from doing the baseline thing that we all came here to do, which was to help people. And so for us, we've gone in and surveyed staff all over the country and said, hey, why did you leave, or why are you leaving? For staff that reported, that they were ready to jump out of our industry. And the top 3 reasons that staff reported that they were leaving all tied to, hey, too much, poorly laid out or unusable, or hopelessness in regards to documentation. And that's what we mean when we're talking about our systems overtaking us. Is, when you go back, for example, to Dr. Bill Schmelter, who brought collaborative documentation to our team in the early 2000 range, and we've been training on that for more than 20 years now. He talked about the day that he decided to use collaborative documentation because he was in his office, he had a consumer who was late. And so he started to get excited because he's like, oh, I'm going to get to catch up on paperwork. And he knew that once he got to 2:08, that was the magical time, because they wouldn't bring somebody back if they were more than 8 minutes late to the agency. And so at 2:06, he opened his computer, 2:07, he opened the first note, and at 2:08, he started to type. And right as he did, the consumer actually walked in the door. And in that moment, he said, I remember in my head going, oh man, he said, I was disappointed, that they actually showed up. And so for us, when you talk about documentation, I'm going to say this as nicely as I can, but it's one of the things that we just kind of have to say, especially in state environments. But when you also go back and look at federal and agencies and others, everybody talks about cutting documentation, but quite honestly, most organizations are doing the opposite. Most organizations are adding more. We're working and seeing, with clients that are working in states that they're adding every outcome measure known. And it was interesting. We were talking one time about, hey, why don't you do the DLA 20? And they're like, because it's too many questions. But then we went back and looked, and by the time they were doing all the PHQ 9 and GAD 7 and everything else, it was actually 58 questions worth of assessments that they were doing. So does it make sense? It's like there's some things happening that just don't make sense. And is it too much narrative? Is it what is it? But this is something you really want to make sure you understand when you're talking about retention. Documentation, again, it's not just the number 1 reason, it's the top 3 reasons that staff report that they're leaving, jumping to private practice, going somewhere else completely. And so again, we want to make sure we know that. The other thing that you're looking at from this particular regard, insufficient pay. Michael, I would agree. It is hard to avoid documentation when it's a requirement for grants. However, what I would also tell you, Michael, is that I can tell you in this particular case, as somebody who's done data mapping all over the country, and also somebody that has helped 5 different states build statewide documentation, that built assessments that could be done in 45 minutes, that built progress notes that could be done in 7.5 minutes, that you can do things that will make it better. And a lot of times what I would also tell you is that when you go in and do things like data mapping and you're going through the 5 things we do with teams to help them reduce their documentation, teams are shocked to see how many things they're doing that were self-inflicted and how many things they're doing that are actually making the situation worse, even though it may have been based upon an original requirement. And I'll give you an example. In working in a statewide form committee one time, it was for the state of Massachusetts, and we took it from 9,735 forms. Make sure you hear that number, 9,735 forms. They reduced it down to 33 forms. And in that particular case, some of the other things that they did was they went in and looked at their mental status exam and realized that yes, the mental status exam was required, but the original version they had way too many questions. And so they cut it back to something that was about a third as long, and that really helped them with their completion time while still getting a very good and valid clinical picture that they needed for that consumer. For a lot of teams, it's about the fact that they're writing so much narrative that is taking forever. And I can tell you for one of the states that we worked in and did data mapping across the state, they were collecting a third as many questions as the national average, but their assessment time frame took twice as long because they were writing so much narrative that they were writing thesis papers every time they brought somebody in for an assessment. So I agree with your question, Michael, and it's a really good one. So I appreciate you asking it, that obviously there are things out there that are going to be required, but we have to look at what we're doing and what we can control, and that's what we work with teams on every day. Oh, and Michael, no, I didn't take your comment as negative in any way, shape, or form. I think you were just willing to verbalize what a lot of people are thinking, because I hear that every day. We hear that every day from our clients. What about this requirement or that requirement? And what I would suggest for you as well, when you talk about the solution, and you're going to see that in these next couple of slides, it's about having the numbers and the information to be able to go back to your funders to push back with. If we just go back to funders and say it's too much, then it becomes an opinion-based conversation. And I've seen that live. I've seen that in some of the work that we've done around things like the NOMs or GIPRAs or things like that. And when we were able to go back and have our clients measure it and present out that, hey, you know what? It adds 200 questions that are not required by anyone else. It adds 45 to 60 minutes. When they were able to start putting parameters to it, it changed the conversation. And that's why you're seeing SAMHSA take some steps to really try to positively impact what's happening with measurement tools like that to try to make it easier on providers, was because the providers out in the community were able to give them that live feedback and those hard numbers that really help them see the challenge. And so when you look at it, it's the same thing here, insufficient pay. I mean, that's definitely measurable. And we see that all over the country right now. We had some teams that contacted us in the state of Virginia that were really looking at how do we try to attract people here. And as we were doing the calculations for them, they were realizing they had to double their pay to even get people to show up. Because, for example, McDonald's in their state was paying $26 an hour. That's $50,000 a year to work in fast food. So does that make sense? Is that, not just in Virginia, we're seeing that all over the country, that, we're having competition from places that we've never had it before. And so pay is becoming a much larger issue. And so again, do we have the ability to pay? Do we have the ability to pay people what they're worth? To have people to be able to have opportunities for advancements. Sometimes it's that people dislike their management, but does it make sense? It's like, we have to look at what are the things that we're doing that are continuing to bring this forward. And for most teams, the challenge there is what we call the incorrect productivity focus. And I'm going to give you what we consider the correct productivity focus, here in just a little bit, to make sure we can go through that together. Because, and this was a question around National Council. This year's National Council Conference in St. Louis was my 20th straight conference that I had presented at, which was pretty cool because I was only one of 2, I think, presenters during the first COVID year. So I'm one of the few people that can actually claim that streak. But when we come to these things, everybody's saying, hey, what are the new topics you're bringing to NatCon? And the reality is that as a consultant, we're still talking about a lot of the same challenges we were when I came in 26 years ago. And so it's really about, hey, what will you do to break the cycle around these things that have plagued us for years? And we've danced around, and in a lot of cases, we've even helped teams change them, and then management changes or staffing changes, and they slide back to what they were doing before. Or, does it make sense? Is like, what do you do to actually bring in a substantive change and move the needle? Because again, we really want to make sure that we're encouraging and inspiring our teams as we move forward. Okay. And so I'm going to give maybe a strange comparison, but anybody who's a college football fan, and normally I'd have you raise your hand, but obviously I can't see any of you. But if you're not a college football fan, I can tell you that I am. I'm a big NC State Wolfpack fan, which means I'm used to losing, but we still love our team and we still go to the games. And here recently, we've actually doing a whole lot better. But when you look at the state of college football right now, if you're not familiar with it, they are dealing with what's called NIL, name, image, and likeness, to where they're now able to pay, and actually are being kind of forced to pay players for name, image, and likeness, and that's completely changing the game of college football. And we've now have transfer portals, and longtime coaches are leaving, and I mean, it's really just kind of in a lot of ways negatively impacting what college football has always been. But again, we're seeing the same thing in our industry. And I can tell you that even more than we were seeing before, and it was happening a lot before, for a lot of traditionally funded Medicaid, Medicare centers, what they're finding is that, again, more than ever, they're becoming the training ground for people who then want to jump to a private for-profit, who then want to go somewhere else where they can make more money, who then want to go somewhere else where they don't have to do as much paperwork. Does that make sense? It's like, we're seeing that there's a lot of competition, and we're having to really go back and let people see why we're different. And what is it that we do that makes us better? Why would you want to stay here versus going somewhere else? And what I can tell you is that Ginger Warner, who I have on the line today, she is someone that, right before we were about to go to St. Louis, she was actually talking with our team about what's your why and how do you communicate your why to people. And for me, it was so powerful at the time, and still is, that I asked her to present that. And so she pivoted very quickly and did that. And so she's going to be doing that again today. So I'm going to hand over to Ginger for her to be able to talk to you about what is your why. And I really would ask that you listen all the way to the end, and you're going to kind of hear it come together, hopefully the same way that I did, around, again, where you can even start from that kind of corporate mindset, but where it really plugs into our industry about what is our why, which hopefully is helping people. But Ginger, please take it away.
Thanks, Scott. I'm so excited to be able to do this again. This type of talk is really important to me because it's not really about marketing, it's really about culture and how our culture affects everything, including staff retention. My background is in the corporate sector, but the challenges that every organization faces are universal. We all want to create amazing and fulfilling client experiences. We all want efficient operations that support our goals and hopefully, and most importantly, don't stand in the way of our progress and our goals. And we want high performing cultures, staff that's well trained, a cohesive team, and an environment that is empowering. But how do we get there? So today I want to talk to you about the building block of all of that and how just one concept can change the trajectory to transform your clinics. Scott, will you go to the next one? So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is the golden circle that was invented by Simon Sinek. He had a TED Talk that went viral several years ago, and this has become a staple in many industries since then for years. And so when we're talking about what your why is, it's because there are also other components that make up how we see ourselves and how our consumers or clients see us as well. There is the why, our purpose, what our cause or our belief is that inspires us to do what we do. Then there's the how. Those are the processes that we take that fulfill our what we do and differentiates us from other organizations. And then the what. This is the result of what we do. Often this is the nuts and bolts of it. You know, we create a computer, for example. That's our result. For too many of us, in fact, almost all of us in every industry, we concentrate on the what we're producing. For Ford, it's we make cars. For HP, it's we make computers. So I'd like to just ask you to take just a quick, like 15, 20 seconds and put in the chat or in the questions, whatever you can see, what is your what right now? How easy is that for you to come up with real quickly? I'm not even sure I can see these, Sam. If you see any questions come up, please let me know. But in the meantime, the what
we've got a couple here. You ready? It's we believe in providing the best care to the people we serve, children and families, human resource professionals to make opportunities, providing health care to our rural community. Those are the ones that I see so far, and helping people be financially stable, permanent supportive housing, vulnerable populations being served.
Excellent. And what's great about working with you guys is you all do have such noble purposes. We all do for what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, you're changing lives, and we're going to get to how that can really change the perspective that we have of ourselves when we have that in our why. So let's get to the next slide. So I want to show you how this concept is a bit mind-blowing because it's based on science. And we can see on this slide how it's reflected in our brain. This outer circle of the golden, this outer section, sorry, of the golden circle, the what, it actually corresponds to the outer section of our brain, the neocortex. And this is the part of the brain, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, responsible for rational and analytical thought. It's the part that understands the facts, the figures, the benefits, and comes up right with an answer. You'd think it'd be responsible for the decision making, and sometimes it should be, but it's not. The middle two circles of the sections of the golden circle, the why and the how, correspond to the middle section of the brain, the limbic system. And this is actually the part of the brain responsible for all of our behavior and decision making and our feelings. We can only be rational and logical after we've been emotional. The primary mode of our brain is to feel, the secondary mode is to think. And so this is why our why is so important. It's the purpose, the first impression, that gut feeling that we have that we lead with. And then to come around from our perspective as leaders in these clinics, it's also how people are making their first impression about you. Many of us believe that if we are not actively marketing, quote unquote, our clinic or our services, that it's not affecting us. But every interaction that your clinic has, from what's on the walls to what's on the website to what's in the waiting room, it communicates your clinic's values and purpose. And if you haven't gotten control of that, you're not in control of the messaging of your organization. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the why that Apple made. Their why has almost nothing to do with their what. I want you to look at that. Everything we do, everything we believe in challenging the status quo and thinking differently. The how is we do this by making products that are beautifully designed and user-friendly. Think of the iPhone, the Macs. The what is we just happen to make great computers. You want to buy one? People don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. People who are choosing Apple over Dell, especially at the beginning, they bought in to this why. Of these, the why, the how, the what, which one do you think helps them attract and retain some of the best talent in the world? The why. Let's go to the next one, Scott. So when we're talking about what your why is and how it affects your company culture, it's important to know it's not your job description. It's your purpose. It's what you do to put the customer first, what you're intentional about. Organizations who are purpose-driven have higher performing teams, better engagement, and better retention. When you know your why, it buoys you and replaces your fears of being seen with a purpose. And by being seen, what we're talking about, it empowers you. It gives you confidence to do your work, and it gives a framework for your decisions and for the structure of your company. Companies that are on a mission, who have a purpose, are far more productive because that energy is contagious and it grounds your employees in that purpose. So I want to give you a little background for me and how this affected me. I was over sales for a large company, and we sold our products across multiple markets: commercial, healthcare, education. This was a company that actually was involved in the construction industry. And we can go to the next slide. And this was one of my, a very small job that we had, but also the most impactful for me. I have a lot of stories surrounding this project. One is I never thought this client was going to work with us because they were a very small company, and they also were from a more rural area, and that was not our target client. So one of the messages there is, don't assume you know everything about everyone. But this is a 50-year-old elementary school, and it had had no love other than putting in more lights, and they did have air conditioning. And I had talked to this man at a conference, and he told me he wanted to make a change, and this was where he wanted to make a change, was in this 50-year-old library. Go to the next slide, please. This is some more pictures of it. You can tell that parts of it were really showing wear. There was some exposed wiring in places. This was their library, and the space was not used well. They wanted a media center, something that was going to be used for the kids more often, something that where they could learn how to learn here in this space instead of having it so unused. Before I showed this next slide, I want you to know, if you had asked me to describe what I did for a living, I would have said that I work for a company that helps people create beautiful interior spaces. That's not a bad slogan, right? We're doing something useful for people. We're helping people meet their goals. Next slide, please. This is the space afterwards. It doesn't even begin to look the same. They can write on the walls. They can, that technology is embedded behind the walls, so they can not worry about anything happening to it. The day that those kids got to walk into that room and see it finished the way that it was, the new space, I got to be there. And honestly, it still brings tears to my eyes to tell you about it, because they were overwhelmed. And I was overwhelmed to be part of that. And it changed my why from creating spaces, helping people create beautiful spaces, to we create spaces where children can learn. We create healthcare spaces where patients can get better treatment, where they're less likely to have infections, where they're more likely to heal. We create education spaces that make children feel valued. I know you can kind of hear it in my voice. I still get teary. It's the why. It's why you do things that really matter. So let's go to this last slide. What is your why? Y'all are amazing. You do amazing work. And what if everyone in your clinic defined themselves every morning like this? This is our why. We save lives. We renew marriages. We help children who've been hurt learn to trust and believe there's good in the world again. We help those who've been in the pit of life to live again and find hope. We help those who can't help themselves. How would that why change your culture? What would you do differently? The way you perform your intake, the way you answer the phone. How would your staff respond if everything in your culture, in your environment, in your operations was based on your why? Scott, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Okay. Thank you, Ginger. And also, again, I appreciate what you said just as much today as I did the first time I heard it. Because again, it's what it's really about. And by the way, I apologize. There were some other folks that sent in their whys. And again, that's why we're leaving this meeting platform and going to another. I cannot get back to the questions right now, but whenever somebody asks another question, I'll be able to see them and I'll read yours out. But there were some good ones in there around criminal justice and just all the things that we're doing. And also somebody who was just saying, thank you for sharing this. So team, this is what it's all about. And so, what I love about what Ginger's talking about there is how, again, she was working for a company that, basically their focus was building walls and building, building material. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, like what did that building material actually bring about? What did it actually do? How did it actually help somebody? And I can tell you for us, that's what we want to look at in our industry. What is your message to your staff? What is your message to your consumers? And I want to highlight something Ginger said. A lot of teams don't think that they're marketing, but everything you do every day is marketing. Did everybody hear that? Because that's a really powerful statement. And if people are calling your agency and they can't get in, or they're walking in the door and the bathroom's dirty and there's nowhere to sit, or there's no signs, or does that make sense? Is like, everything that we do is messaging, and everything that we do is marketing to our consumers and our staff. And so what you have to really look at again is, are we sending the right messages? Is it the same message? And again, is it working? Was it working before and is it working now? And for a lot of teams, the answer is no, it's not. And that's why, again, we're seeing consumers leave, we're seeing staff leave, and we really want to be able to do something different in that regard. Okay. So when you go back and look at this, team, this is what we're looking at. And just so the power of a fresh set of eyes is amazing. And if you've never done this before, would highly encourage you to go in and live a day in the life of your consumers and or the life of your staff. And assuming we probably have a lot of managers on the line, and if not, that's okay. But a lot of times we do. When is the last time you filled out an assessment? When is the last time you ran a session? When is the last time you worked with your scheduling system? When's the last time you came and literally just sat in your parking lot and looked at your building? And that might sound silly, but I come from a corporate environment again. And one of the things that I used to do, especially when I'd been on assignment at a place for a while, is at least once a month, I would go pick up my breakfast. I would come and I would sit in my car or my truck or whatever I was driving, and I would just look at the building. And it's really funny that if you sit there and just look for 5 minutes, the things that you will start to notice that you walk by every day, when you're going in every day. I mean, I would see signage that was like crooked or anything. I mean, there's just to not get too far into that point. But the fresh set of eyes is important, and that's what Ginger did for us, because one of the things she even helped us see, and we actually went back and for the conference and are kind of moving forward, really wanted to go out there and show our why, which is that we help teams measure so that they can have the right starting points to transform, to get to where they want to be, and then maximize the changes that they're putting into place. And one of the most important parts of that, and why that is so important in today's environment, is that staff are more tired than ever. And so if you're going to do a change, if you're going to go in and work with someone, you need to make sure that whatever change you're putting into place actually is moving them to something that's making the system better. And so if you're putting a change into place that's going to bring about more documentation, more process, more, more of the things that they're already drowning in, then you're not heading in the right direction. And so that's really what we want to be able to do. And so David Lloyd actually coined what he called the Noah's Ark principle. And he used this for teams or with teams for years. Matter of fact, one of our teams out in Arkansas had hats made. And one of them had raindrops on them, and the other one had a boat and Noah's Ark on it, because they were saying, hey, are you talking about the fact that it's raining? Because we already know that. We're all wet. We know that it's raining. Are you talking about the solution, or are you talking about the rain? And so if somebody needed to complain and talk about the rain, they would throw them the rain hat. And if they wanted to talk about the solution and how we're going to get ourselves out of the rain, they would throw them the Ark hat. But does that make sense? Is that, when you look at this, we really need to be able to see where are we as an organization and what are we going to be able to do about this. And so I wanted to highlight this chart for you. Surviving organizations, which sadly we see a lot of, and we get a lot of calls from surviving organizations, they're the traits that are here on the left versus what we do with teams every day and help teams to do, which is move to thriving. And that's why, again, I love my job. And that's why our team, we love our job, is because we want to be able to go in and help. So for example, lack of ability to provide timely access to care versus providing same-day access. We have taken over 1,000 organizations into the same-day access protocol. And why that's exciting to me is we know that nationally speaking, the average access center has a 75% dropout rate over the first 3 contacts, whereas a same-day access environment, we successfully move 90 to 95% of the people through. So it is a massive difference in regards to engaging those consumers and then ultimately, being able to get them to a solid outcome. We have teams that struggle to know their costs, or even how to break their data up to get to their true costs. And we really need to be able to know those costs all the way down to CPT or HCPCS codes levels if we're going to pay our staff. Does that make sense to everybody? People are here because they love their consumers, but this is not a hobby. They're not here working for free. They're not here working as a volunteer most of the time. They need a paycheck, and they need to be able to be paid as well. Again, do we have supervisors that are subjective and kind of reprocessing things, during a crisis time, or do we have leaderships that are looking out into the future? We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a little bit. Do we have triangular-based management team discussions, meaning that we're just kind of going around and around, versus compliance-based determination of quality and cost-effective levels for appropriate for the organization? We see that a lot, that teams, again, they're reacting. They're having a lot of compliance concerns that they don't even see, they don't even know. What about inadequate clinical or non-clinical staff performance standards? Do the staff even know what they're required to do? But more importantly, are they actually doing it? And if they're not, are we just letting that happen? And the answer for most teams is yes. And so what happens is that there starts to become distrust, especially between clinical and non-clinical staff. And so it just kind of grows upon itself. We have to have comprehensive standards so that everybody working there knows that they're valued, and everybody that's working there knows they're going to be supported. And they don't feel like they're on an island and having to do everything by themselves. And so as we're doing that, we can work to hopefully bring in appropriate salary increases and have the right career paths for staff. Because again, as we have a healthier system, we're able to see more people, bill more, do the things that we want or need to do. Okay. For teams that are continually looking at monthly concern around meeting budgets and no remaining fund balances, versus teams that again are performing well and they've taken the areas of negative impact away from staff, so staff can engage consumers and do the things they need to do. But is everybody following? And I kind of skipped these last couple. You can see them for yourselves. We need to be in an environment that staff feel comfortable that they're heading in the right direction and that we're all heading in the right direction as an agency. And so if you find yourself in constant crisis and you find yourself constantly having to put out fires and reassure people, then you're probably not ready or you're not where you need to be yet, which is to be a visionary leader that's utilizing data to see what's ahead and to ultimately to be able to move staff forward. Because what I can tell you very clearly, and the rest of my staff can as well. Now, by the way, data is not for bludgeoning. Let me make sure I put that tag in there. You want to celebrate with data just as much as you want to point out concerns. But what we can tell you is that we see a lot of teams that get stuck here. There's only 2 things I don't like: change and the way things are. And so what we see in regards to retention concerns is that ultimately what we're seeing is that, for staff, they're really struggling around the fact that, they want it to change because they don't like what's happening right now, but they're comfortable where they are, and so they get upset when you change it. And so if you're going into that environment, you're going into a little bit of a hornet's nest there, sometimes a really big hornet's nest, because now again, we don't like our forms, but then you go to change them. But hey, these are our forms, and Bob built this form, and I built that form, and so that makes sense. It's like, there's a lot of personal ownership and opinion. So you have to have data to really be able to make sure that you can move them through. And you have to have the data to be able to say, hey, I understand that change can be upsetting. And hey, I understand that change can be something that people don't like, but I know that this is going to benefit us in the end. This is going to help us attract staff, retain staff, and get us out of where we are right now, which is the constant turnover that leads to more turnover that's causing all these challenges to begin with. Okay, and so that's really what we're looking at in this regard, is how do we have the right data and information to be able to move us forward. And Mac, who's one of our consultants, he's a 30-year police and military veteran, and so he normally puts it pretty black and white, and I love that about him. He sat in on one of his first meetings with me to where I was helping a team do gap analysis and measure out their access flow to see where their challenges were so we could do something about it. And I asked him at the end, I said, so what did you think? And he said, you were trying to find the beginning to your Google map. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I'm a cop, and I would get calls all the time, and I had to know where I was to be able to get to where I wanted to be. He said, you're trying to help these organizations see where they actually are so that they know how to get to where they're going. And what I can tell you as somebody who's done this for 26 years with over 1,000 organizations, most organizations do not understand where they actually are. Most organizations, to be honest, are looking at things with a little bit of rose-colored glasses on, and they ultimately feel like that they're doing a lot better than they are. And we find that especially when we go in and start surveying staff, surveying consumers, and looking at those pieces. And so when you're looking at, okay, am I possibly one of those folks? Let's talk about that, to make sure that we ultimately are able to make sure you know where to go. The main things you want to look at in regards to finding success for your organization and knowing where to measure and to look for the smoke, because if there's smoke, there's fire, is understanding things like, for example, your access system. We have a lot of teams out there that are saying, hey, we're doing same-day access. If somebody's in crisis, we can get them in today. Well, that's great, but that's not same-day access. Same-day access means that everybody who walks in your facility can be seen same day and be seen for a follow-up appointment within 7 to 10 days. But does that make sense? It's like those timelines and all those guides, they're not there just because. They're there because they make a massive difference in whether or not that consumer is going to engage and whether or not that consumer is going to come back and get to the outcomes that you want or need. So again, same-day access, just-in-time prescriber scheduling, those are the things that we work with teams on every day. Obviously, you've heard us talk about forms and IT systems. Are they actually working for you? We talk about this pretty pointedly with teams, that we have a lot of organizations out there that, quite honestly, they're putting up with EHRs that don't work. They've never worked. And if we're going to be honest with each other, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into them, they're never going to work. But ultimately, we continue down that road. And one of the things that we talk with our teams about is saying, hey, don't get stuck on a mistake because you spent a long time making it. And for a lot of teams, that's where we find their forms and their IT systems, is that they feel like because we've worked with them for so long, or we put so much money into it, we have to stick with it. And again, that doesn't work. It just continues to frustrate your staff. And again, they feel like the systems are more important than they are. And that's where you see those challenges and places go in. And so that's why we tell you to go out and fill out some forms, go fill out an assessment, go do a session, see if you can do collaborative documentation or not, because collaborative documentation is something that we see that drops sick time usage by 40%. It's something we see that saves the average clinician 250 hours or 31 days a year in post-session documentation. But does that make sense? Is that, these are the kind of things you want to be able to look at to say, hey, well, our systems actually even support these types of pieces to really be able to move us, to where we want to be. You heard me reference statewide form sets, or again, doing data mapping. And this goes back to a question that Michael, again, I really appreciated your question in the beginning, and so I want to repeat it here. Data mapping is about going in and taking your forms and looking at every single question you're asking your consumer. And you're looking at that, to look at how well you're doing in regards to not burning your consumer out, but again, also more importantly, your staff. And knowing that the top 3 reasons that staff report leaving is documentation, data mapping, and or gap analysis to look at those completion times is something that you have to do if you truly want to retain your staff. And so for teams across the country, that's what we help them with. And so we just highly suggest, if you've never done that, you really want to look at it. If not, you're going to be saying one thing with your mouth and another thing with your actions, and staff will leave. As well, agile focused IT changes, looking at what you're going to have to do for data sharing, if with DCOs, if you're in a CCBHC environment. Does that make sense? Is that these are the things you want to be able to do. Appropriate no-show and engagement policies. We work with teams all the time to say, hey, do you have episode of care guidelines or no-show and engagement policies? And let me give you a stat in regards to why that's important. If you look at federal audits from across the country, what we know is that 60% of the average clinician's caseload, according to federal auditors, should no longer be there. And so when you look at that, that is a really telling stat around, hey, are we continuing to schedule people that aren't showing up the way they should when we've got people waiting at the door to get in that we could or should be bringing in? And how do we do something different? How do we work to hopefully engage those consumers, or if not, to appropriately close them out or put them to a maintenance level? But we have to do something different versus just continuing to schedule people in that aren't showing up. Do we have the best back office readiness in place? And we work with a lot of teams on this because we're seeing that they're doing all kinds of things. They're documenting, they're delivering service, but they can't bill it. They can't get paid. So does it make sense? Like, it's not going to do any good if we can't get to that point. And so we have to really make sure that we're in good shape. And this is a big one, do you have a wellness plan in place, and a true wellness plan that you're really looking at and offering opportunities for staff to be able to have somebody to talk to? I know that we actually did that for our team, especially coming out of COVID, that we have someone on staff, Leanne, and she actually also works with teams around the country, going in and doing wellness checks and going in and doing assessments to really go back and look at and see, are your staff doing as well as you think they are? And if not, what are you doing to try to help them succeed? And that's really where we want to go, because ultimately, and getting to the last part of our presentation and making sure we also do leave a little bit of time here for additional questions at the end, is that when you look at what's happening for your staff, they're either happy or they're leaving. And when you go back and you look at that, a lot of times people will say, well, Scott, it's always been that way. We understand, but it's never been like this. It's never been to where, again, we're running 40% vacancy rates, and the cycle of staff leaving is much shorter than it's ever been, especially post-COVID. And so what we're really having to look at, for a lot of teams, they're saying things like, hey, we can't say the word productivity, we can't hold anybody accountable, or they'll leave. And so, they really, get stuck and kind of get into a paralysis. What we're finding and what staff have reported to us is that they're actually not frustrated by the concept of productivity. They're frustrated by targets they can't hit because their systems aren't where they need to be. So does that make sense for everybody? Is that, we have all these things that are happening, to where our staff aren't trusting each other. It's creating to where they feel unfair. There's low morale that produces low productivity, which produces high crisis. Does everybody follow me? It's a cyclical thing. And so, for staff, it really continues to lead to a high staff turnover rate. And so we have to do something different. Because ultimately, when you get to the crux of all of this, for me, productivity is not something that you outlaw. Productivity is not something that you say, hey, we don't talk about, or we're going to call it revenue units, or whatever magical name you want to put to it. It's understanding that productivity drives so much more than cost. You have to understand the chain reaction around productivity, because productivity, when you look at that direct service production, that ultimately gets to the most important part of what we do, and the important asset that we have as an organization is capacity. Can we even get them in the door? And I would assume that everybody on this, this webinar would agree, you can't help somebody if you can't see them. You can't help somebody if you can't have a conversation with them. And again, feel free to let me know if you disagree, but you have to have some way to communicate with those consumers, find out what's going on in their world, have conversations, do care coordination, do case management, do medication, whatever it is that you do in the agency. But to be able to do that, you have to have somewhere for them to come in so they can be seen. And so if we don't have direct service productivity, we don't have capacity. If we don't have capacity, wait times go up. If wait times go up, show rates go down. Treatment outcomes go down. And so ultimately our costs will go higher because we're now seeing fewer people successfully. As that happens, we're ultimately seeing, our costs go out of range. Therefore, we can't fund system changes, and therefore our staff and or our consumers aren't happy, and so they leave. But does everybody follow there? Because especially when we're dealing with paperwork systems, we're dealing with no-shows, we're dealing with all those types of things. It's a major concern for us as we go through and look at this, and try to really understand that we have to make sure that productivity doesn't become a bad word. We have to understand why, if staff cannot hit their productivity goal, why? And what I mean by that is productivity is not a measure of how hard staff are working. Productivity is a measure of how well our systems are working to support our staff. If your staff universally cannot hit their productivity standard, there is something wrong in your system. And I'm going to quote Kathy Hagan. Kathy Hagan is one of our consultants that works with same-day access. She does a lot of work on CCBHC. She's a clinical director, a former clinical director out of Washington State. And she said something in one of her presentations that just hit me right between the eyes. She said, let me put it to you this way. If a couple of your staff are struggling, then that means they're struggling, and you need to go work with those staff, and you need to help them, to be able to do what they need to do. But if all of your staff are struggling, then that's on you. That's on you as a leader. That's on your system. That means something is wrong. If nobody can hit the target, that means there's a bigger problem. And I hope everybody takes that for the way it's meant. It's not meant to be a negative statement as much as saying, hey, what is the system noise? And system noise is anything that keeps staff from being able to do the job they want to do, which is helping consumers in need. What is the system noise? Is it paperwork? Is it no-shows? Is it non-billable service? Is it too many meetings? Is it too much travel? What is it that's causing your staff to not be able to encounter their consumers in the way that you want or need them to? Because if you can't fix that, then staff will continue to burn out. They will continue to go away. Okay. And so when you look at this, and I'm going to actually kind of come down, I'm going to come down to one thing that I really want to make sure that you see today, or a couple last quick thoughts I want to make sure you see today, and then we're gonna jump back and we're gonna make sure we answer questions here for our last 5 minutes. Again, if you're in a scheduling system, and this is what we see in standard scheduling systems right now, the average no-show rate is around 35 to 40%. So we're scheduling 10 appointments, and then we have staff with 4 empty chairs and no one to see. We can't get upset with those staff if they're not able to meet productivity, versus when we're doing things like same-day access or just in time, and we're scheduling 10 appointments and we're having 90% or 9 out of 10 showing up. We're doing something different. We're changing the continuum. Does that make sense? Is that you can't continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. You have to change what's going on for your consumers or for your staff so that they can better help their consumers. Or for example, we talked about documentation. So I wanted to make sure I got to this, at least this example for today. When you talk about moving from general anxiety to specific anxiety, we hear teams all the time say, hey, we have a paperwork problem, but I want to be able to go in and actually measure this out by staff. And this is an example of that, to where a team came in and said, hey, this is a staff member, and we can tell they're struggling because we can see their numbers. And we can see that, in this particular case, from April through October, we're looking at how many of their pieces of documentation were turned in 10 to 50 days after the service took place. And that's what this pink is. And you can see that for this staff member, better than 9 out of 10 of their pieces of documentation were turned in 10 to 50 days after their service took place. So this organization took action. They implemented collaborative documentation, and this same staff member turned in 94% of their documentation same day the following month. Does everybody follow? They did something. They measured. They saw the challenge, and they did something to help their staff. And this staff member, along with several others that they had identified that were a part of this collaborative documentation pilot, came back at the end and said, you do realize I was about to leave. You do realize I had already started my letter of resignation, but now I'm going to stay because now I can actually finish my job and I can actually leave work every day done. And that's really where we want and need to be, is our staff being able to walk out finished every day. Okay. So again, I want to make sure we leave our last 5 minutes here for questions. And so let's see what we have there. And again, for some of the feedback, people have already said this was helpful, so I hope so. So hopefully, please let us know, and or if it wasn't, let us know if there are things we could have done better today. But for us, these are the themes and the pieces that teams are looking at, is how do we actually adjust our systems? So we'd love to hear from you on those things that you're trying to adjust, and or you want feedback on in regards to how you adjust them, and we'll try to help you here in our last couple of minutes. So Samantha, I cannot actively see the questions for some reason right now. So if there are ones coming in, please highlight them for me or chat them into the presenter screen. And again, we cannot get to Zoom webinar fast enough. Will the slides be available? Yes, very much so. Along with, we are also recording this. And somebody's asking, can we explain more about the collaborative documentation system? Certainly can. What you're looking at for collaborative documentation is that you're actively working to do the note with the consumer present. And you're working to do your documentation with the consumer present. And the key to that is that it ultimately helps significantly reduce your audit risk. So, we know that there's a lot of federal, funds being taken back. It reduces audit risk dramatically for most teams by about 65 to 70%. But more importantly, what it does is it increases outcomes, it increases engagement, because instead of us writing the note outside of the session and kind of guessing at what the consumer thought, we're doing it together and literally saying, hey, here's what I thought about today. What did you think about today? And even if it's negative, I'm going to write that down, because the next section in my note is going to be, okay, what's our plan for next time? If you didn't like what we did today, okay, we'll do something different. Or, if you did, then, then we're going to keep this going so we can work through that goal and objective. But that's what collaborative documentation is about. And again, the biggest key is that it saves the average clinician about an hour a day, 5 hours a week. That comes out to 250 hours a year in time they're losing outside of the session. And this is the biggest number I want you to hear. In regards to engagement rates, what consumers are reporting is a 97 to 98%, and that's over 30,000 consumers that we've surveyed in 48 states, a 97 to 98% approval rating in regards to the fact that it made them feel more involved in their care, or at least as good as what it used to be. But the bulk majority is that they made them feel much more involved in their care. And so for us, we're really excited about that and the positives that we see. And obviously, if you want to send me an email, I'll be glad to send you even more information, or we can also send that out. This overall strategy is the same, looking at small versus large organizations. Small guys do not always have the infrastructure to implement some of these strategies. It's a great question you're asking. For us, yes, we have seen that almost all of these things are scalable. When you talk about same-day access, the only thing you have to have there is just looking at your overall volume. If you've got more than around 35 to 40 intakes a month, collaborative documentation, as a full system would be workable. If not, there's some other things you can do to still, do positive impact there. Collaborative documentation, definitely. Episode of care, level of care, definitely. All of these things that we see, no-show and engagement policies, honestly, they're even more important for a smaller agency than a larger agency, because you have even fewer resources to work with. So to answer your question, yes, it's definitely scalable. And we work with everyone from small, small centers that are, $500,000, budgets to $220 million, and actually in a couple of cases, even larger than that. And we found that, it's the same concepts. We just have to, have the right data and the right measurement to make sure we're looking at the right things. Okay. So team, thank you for the positive comments. I'm glad that the information was helpful. Again, if there's anything else that we can do for you, please let us know, because this is what we live for, is to work with teams, every day to help them help others. So really, really appreciate your time today. We'll make sure that we send out a link and everything else along with the slides. And again, hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for all that you're doing out in your community.